Our last topic this week is East Asia, and so I'm going to begin with Japan. At the end of the last video, I talked about how China is a pretty conservative society, and part of that is the influence of outside invasions and a desire to resist outside invasions. With Japan, we have a society on an island, and so we have a society which in general, well, it's not the only reason, but it seems to have been a factor in Japanese society being significantly more confident and being significantly more confident in its own distinct identity. Japan has extremely fertile soil, but only in 20% of the islands. The rest of the land is mountainous, difficult to unify if you're the government, difficult to produce food from that land if you're a farmer. It's also at the meeting point of the tectonic plates of Asia and the Pacific Ocean. And so that's part of the reason why the soil is so fertile, but it also means that Japan is exceptionally vulnerable to earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, natural disasters like this. The legend of the founding of Japan is that Japan was the offspring of two of the fertility gods that are established as an official cult in Japan called Shinto. What's significant about this is that this cult persists even into the modern era. Again, it's a sign of the confidence of the Japanese that this type of religion, which is typically considered to be more primitive, isn't replaced by a type of monotheism, one of the great monotheistic religions, although it is augmented by Buddhism, and this shows you that the Chinese are going to influence this society as well. From around 1000 BCE, we have evidence of the cultivation of crops, and then we start to see unification against Chinese influence as we arrive in the AD or the Common Era. And so the Japanese form a centralized, unified government in order to resist Chinese influence. However, after resisting the Chinese, we see Japan break apart and be divided between a warrior aristocracy. And the aristocracy employs a class of warriors called samurai warriors to defend their own local interests. A little later, around the 12th century, we find a new effort to unify Japan in a system of government that's called the Shogunate, in which the emperor remains a weak figurehead, but there is a powerful general chosen from among these aristocrats who exercises power and can unify the Japanese together. And the Shogunate is successful in defeating the Mongols, preventing the Mongols from invading Japan. It's a pretty impressive track record. Very few other areas in the world, very few other peoples in the world were able to resist the Mongols. The Japanese could, but after resisting the Mongols, the Shogunate once again declined and Japan was once again divided. Although from this point onwards, from the 13th century onwards, we still see the growth of manufacturing and the growth of commerce in Japan. And so it's an interesting question to ask whether it was good for Japanese development that they were that much more isolated than other peoples that we've looked at in this history class. When we come to Korea, we find a slightly different story because it's not an island, it's a peninsula. There's constant debate over the extent of Chinese influence. We see Confucianism, Buddhism, and Chinese government practices are all used by the Koreans. Sometimes they're used kind of like the Japanese did in order to establish a centralized government and to be able to resist Chinese influence. But Chinese influence is certainly much more powerful in Korea than in Japan. When the Mongol Empire is forged in the 13th century, the Mongols conquer Korea, and this is considered a particularly difficult period in Korean history, when many Koreans were forced to carry out labor in conditions that verged on slavery for their Mongol rulers. Lastly, we come to Vietnam. Vietnam was a Chinese tributary under the rule of the Han, even under the rule of the Tang. After the fall of the Tang, the Vietnamese are able to achieve their independence. Again, they employ Confucianism, the idea of a civil service based on exams that the Tang had began and which the Song would perfect. These legacies of Chinese culture they use as well to establish a unified kingdom that extends all the way down the peninsula of Southeast Asia. And so these are our 3 East Asian countries that we're going to look at this week. It shows the varying influence of China. China is such a huge, powerful civilization. It stands to reason that all 3 of these much smaller civilizations will be influenced by it. But the degree to which the Chinese exercise an influence and the extent of that influence, that changes, as you can see, with the different countries. Hope this is helpful. Hope you have a good time this week in the class, and I'll see you in week 3.